That's my little intro there, ladies and gentlemen. Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire, a not so great song that is a great song. We're coming to you live here from Waukesha, Wisconsin. Bismarck, well, actually not from Bismarck. We actually have two individuals in Waukesha, Wisconsin for this session. San Diego, California, and the beautiful Central Coast community of Cambria, California, as I enjoy our traditional family vacation. And so welcome to our fourth episode of the summer program editions of the Constitution in American Life. Just so we're clear, the following intro to our program today represents the mind and views of yours truly. I have no idea how or what the other friends of Publius feel or think, and they are free to agree or disagree. I know that I should be in a joyous mood, given that right outside my window here, I have a vast, expansive view of the Pacific Ocean. However, in the last 2 weeks, our super legislative branch, previously known as the Supreme Court, has undermined everything I knew to be true about our constitutional system of government. For all of my adult life, I was taught, and I learned the following truths: that the arc of history bends towards justice, that individual rights are not absolute, that our framers created a secular government that established a wall of separation between church and state, and that the ultimate expression of personal liberty was the sovereignty of one's own mind and body. If government were given the power to regulate either, then we can conclude that constitutional government has failed. It is not only the end results of the decisions delivered by our super legislative branch, but it is the reasoning they used to come to their conclusions. For gun laws, from what I understand, we cannot trust the states to pass laws that promote liberty and the common good, but for reproductive freedom, we must trust the states. Most offensive is the convoluted understanding of history that the supermajority used in their opinions. If I understand correctly, our laws, regulations must be strictly bound by the understanding of representatives in 1788 and 1868, therefore forever binding us to the world of white, male, elite agrarian interests. Well, since I have learned that all laws must emanate from the minds of men born in the 18th and 19th century, let me conclude with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. With that said, let's move on to our discussion of what we understand about America's constitutional arrangement. Our task is to address the following. How have the values and principles embodied in the Constitution shaped American institutions and practices? In short, we hope to shine some light, understanding that our super legislature could change everything tomorrow, on the institutions of Congress, the presidency, as well as our system of federalism. So Professor Moore, let's go ahead and start our conversation with you, the professional historian who dedicates his life to the study of this document and the ratification. So much of our constitutional system is derived from the British experience and British structure. However, we end up in the 1780s in the Philadelphia Convention and ratification, rejecting the parliamentary system. Why for so? What factors contributed to the decision by the framers to not follow the British model?
I would say I think that's a great question, but I think there's assumption in it that I would take exception to. I think in large part the 1780s I think is more important than our British legacy. I think in part we reject the parliamentary system because we had a parliamentary system under the Articles, in the sense that there was no executive, and there were committees. The Articles Congress had powerful chairmen, if you will, of these committees, and several of them were not elected to the Congress. And so we had kind of an American version of a parliamentary system. In fact, I think in many ways we have the Articles parliamentary system and Robert Morris to thank for our rejection or our embracing of a presidential system. I mean, Robert Morris through the 80s was a very powerful person, ran the finances, a very unenviable task. And he constantly was running into headbutting with the members of the Articles Congress. And he constantly would say, well, if you don't like the way I'm doing things in running this finance committee, then I tell me so or fire me. Well, they eventually do fire him. So I think the parliamentary system of the 80s under the Articles is in large part why we embrace presidential systems. But also, I think there's this traditional fight about how strong of an executive, and we'll probably get into this later, how strong of an executive do we want that executive to be? We know, and here's where I think the British legacy does get some traction. I do think it's overstated, the boogeyman of the king. But I would say that it's more of a rejection of the American parliamentary system under the Articles that leads us to what we wind up with at Philadelphia, more so than the British legacy.
One of the key, to me, principles of constitutional government is the notion of accountability. And at least in the last 100 years or so, I think the British do a fairly good job. And in fact, a lot of members of parliament who get themselves in trouble are expected to resign. And there's a lot of pressure from party leadership for them to do so because of the overall effect on party. I'm curious, Tim and others, what is our system of accountability? How do we hold, individual members of Congress accountable to the people? Is it just elections? Is that it?
Well, I mean, I'm sure Chris and Mike are more knowledgeable of this, but it does seem to me that the trite answer is elections. But the reality is the party system and the gerrymandering and the way that our electoral system works, the accountability is and the weakening of parties over time. And I think Chris and Mike can speak to that more than I can. But I think the party accountability is not there in the American system by definition, nor the way it's operated in the last 100 years.
Well, I would push back a little bit on that, Tim, is I think in more very modern, very modern times, I'm going to say like within the last few years, I think you've seen party leaders unable to hold their members accountable, where I think obviously elections, but you also have the rules within their own institutions, as students will know that, each chamber is in charge of establishing its own rules. And for all you kids taking AP government, you know that the rules committee is one of the most powerful committees you can be on, because if you can make the rules, you can control the game, so to speak. But I think the part of the issue in a very modern sense is I think you have elected representatives, whether it be House or senators, that they don't necessarily kowtow to that party leadership. That you've seen some people in both parties, kind of wander away from the norm. And traditionally, I think that you get called into, say, the speaker's office or the majority leader's office, and maybe have a little come to Jesus meeting about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And you should not be doing that, because then you can, that power will emanate from those leadership positions. And if you get cut off from that power traditionally, then, it doesn't serve you well, and it doesn't serve your constituents well. So you had to play the game. More recently, I don't think you see that as much.
I would agree with that. I think at a more sort of macro level, I would just add that I think the purpose of the setup of our government wasn't for accountability. It was to limit the power. And so it's it's to not let power like accumulate in one branch, right? That was the goal. So you spread out the power, and by doing so, you make accountability really, really difficult. For an average citizen, who do you blame or who do you give credit to when a certain policy passes or does not pass? In our system, it's set up to make it more difficult for actors to act unwarrantedly, and it makes it harder for us as citizens to hold them accountable when compared to the parliamentary system, which is the exact opposite.
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit too, David, to your original question with Tim. And I think part of the issue too, and Tim alluded to our government under the Articles. And I think about if you think about, and I always go to that last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, we're free and independent states, which means we're free and independent of Great Britain, but we're free and independent of each other. And it's that sovereignty word, so that now that we have sovereignty within our what was or maybe our colonial legislature, which is now our brand new state legislature, we're reluctant to give that up to some nebulous body that's going to be created by this document. So therein you see a lot of the arguments of the convention and ends up with the compromise, the Connecticut Compromise.
Well, obviously the British, Parliament functions within a unitary system. Is it your point, Chris, that parliamentary systems don't kind of function within a federal republic? That would be problematic?
Well, no, I think the snarky answer is Madison lost. Because if you look at the Virginia plan, I mean, I think those are the things he wants to set up basically a parliamentary system. But the reluctance, I think, of the other framers to dive into that, I think comes back to this concept of, well, we've got this power at our state level. Why do I want to? And you see this with Rhode Island, they don't even send anybody, as most of the students and teachers watching this know that. They don't even send anybody to the convention. So if we've got the power at the state level, I'm very reluctant to give that up to this new body that you're proposing here coming out of Philadelphia. I don't know if the parliamentary system, David, would be more responsive as opposed to the presidential system that we have. I don't know. I mean, you could give it a try, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Is India a federal republic? I mean, this is Mike's expertise, how this works in other places.
Yeah, I mean, India and Germany both come to mind as parliamentary systems that are federal. But I mean, the reason most countries that are federal in the world are countries that are really large and diverse. So it's kind of baked in that policymaking may be a little more difficult in those places than a place like Britain. We know that Great Britain is not homogenous for sure, but it's not as diverse as an India or a United States or even a Germany to some extent. So
Chris, let's look at the powers that were granted to Congress, given our constitutional, or how our constitutional history has played out over the last 230, 40 years, couldn't we conclude that the framers were wrong about fearing the legislative branch more than they feared the executive or judicial branch, especially most recently here? I mean, we're told over and over again that, oh my God, this dangerous legislative branch, that's why we have to enumerate the powers. But as we look, especially in the 20th and 21st century, it doesn't seem to have played out. What are your thoughts?
I'll say the first part of your question, David, is I don't think they were wrong. I think as originally designed, I think the Article 1, the legislative branch, was the branch to be feared because therein lied at the time, and still to this day, actually, let's say that to this day lies most of the power. But I think what we said, and we've said this on numerous programs over time, what we've seen is the legislative branch pulls back away from some of its Madisonian duties, right, or obligations, and we've said this before: nature abhors a vacuum. So when Congress is not using its power, then you're going to have an executive that's going to step in and get it, or you're going to have a judicial branch that's going to step in. I think the judicial branch is forced to weigh in simply because our Congress hasn't. But I don't think the framers are wrong, because I think as it originally came out, we had Marbury v. Madison, and so you're not going to, maybe McCulloch is the next most important case after that. I don't know, maybe. So I think they were right to fear the legislative branch the most, because therein lies the most power. However, where we are now, I think you see a Congress, and it could be because we're so fractured in terms of party politics, that there's no longer that institutional jealousy. That ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The idea of giving each branch the ability to check the power of the other branches, we don't see that happening now. I think
well, and they're coming out of this legislative supremacy tradition too. I mean, back to the British origins question. So they inherit that concern, and some of the states, colonies, when they created their constitutions, did create a more aggressive executive. But I would say the legacy of British legislative supremacy is kind of lurking in the shadows at the founding.
Well, and again, that, this piggybacks on my question about accountability. I mean, what kind of system that's supposed to have three distinct branches of government with certain powers, and as you said, Chris, they're supposed to be jealous of those powers. What kind of system makes it so darn easy for the most powerful branch to abdicate its powers? I mean, isn't that a flaw?
Well, there's a flaw in your question, I would say, David. They didn't create three distinct branches; they created overlapping branches. I mean, we use that illustration where the circles are separated, but that's not. They didn't create that illustration. That's the illustration that's used in classroom. So they blended those. Branches, and that's some of the anti-federalist critique, that it was too blended. So the distinct separation is not there when you read the text of the Constitution.
So you would argue, therefore, the framers wouldn't be that surprised by the extent of which Congress has abdicated its power, especially to the executive branch.
Wow, I don't have my crystal ball. I'd have to go. I'd have to go down to the basement and find the crystal ball to answer that question. But I mean, that's a fair question. I just don't. I don't know whether they'd be surprised or not. I mean, there's so much potentially they'd be surprised at. I don't know whether that's one of them.
I mean, didn't Mason himself fear a cabal between the Senate and the executive?
Sure. Yep.
And it seems to some degree that's kind of what has happened here. And by the way, I think your crystal ball, not your crystal ball, but you probably could call Justice Alito. He seems to have his finger on the heartbeat of American history, and has it all so rightfully understood there.
Well, David, let me jump in real quickly, and I think I've used this in I think we might be talking about Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein coming up, but in their book, and I've used this before, it's even worse than it looks. They talk about, and there's a great line that I remember highlighting when I read it, that we have politicians in a separation of powers government acting as if they're in a parliamentary system.
Yeah.
So they forget, back to that institutional jealousy. Now it has become party allegiance and not institutional allegiance. And I think that's where the framers, and I don't have Tim's crystal ball or Justice Alito's crystal ball, but I think that's where, if the framers were to come back, they would. I think that's that party aspect that we live in today. I think that would somewhat. But I guess let me back up. I'm going to check myself here, because I mean, Jefferson was all about party. I mean, and as was Madison, and as were others. So maybe not. But I thought that was an interesting perception by Mann and Ornstein. The idea that there's supposedly a separation of powers, but they're not acting like it.
Well, let's check in with Professor Williams here, because that's kind of where I was headed, and that is, obviously they could not have imagined, I would assume, the evolution of political powers and how how influential political parties would be on on our system. So, Professor Williams, to what extent have parties kind of altered the vision that Madison and others had on how Congress would function?
I've been thinking about this, and I'm not quite sure, because Madison and Jefferson and the founders, they knew that parties were going to exist, right? And they knew that they were actively participating in very partisanship politics. So I think it's wrong to teach students that back in the good old days, there weren't parties and there wasn't partisanship. I mean, we could argue whether the 1780s were one of the most partisanship periods in our history, right? Along with other periods. I do think, though, that parties are functioning differently today than the founders would have imagined. And I don't have a crystal ball either. But to me, the root of that is that because our national government has taken responsibility for so much more than the founders could have ever imagined, right? I mean, the scale of the policymaking, the scale of the problems that national government's being asked to solve is so much bigger, which is only going to amplify the role of parties in that system. What I do think has changed, though, we've become more small d democratic than the founders probably could have envisioned. I think primary elections, I think gerrymandering have increased polarization in a way that the founders maybe have not recognized or would not recognize. But I say that, going back to what I said at the beginning, the founders would recognize polarization because they lived during very polarizing times.
I guess, and I mean, I understand that we, getting into the depths of the mind of the framers is probably a little foolish on my attempt here, but I guess my problem is if we believe half of what they wrote in the Federalist, and we go to Federalist 51, which Chris already somewhat referenced, all right, the whole foundation of our system is factions and the multiplicity of factions. And the whole remedy was to keep that multiplicity of factions in order to distill, all right, this national general will or national common good. But parties work in opposition of that. Parties try to centralize this multiplicity into a much more singular kind of factional voice. And I understand that they were partisan. I understand they saw parties, but again, they, I guess that's my trouble with Madison, especially, to be such an advocate of these parties when it seems to go against the grain of the very foundation of how we would protect ourselves, from faction. Does that make sense?
Well, I do think they may. I mean, I agree with Mike on the notion that they're in a highly factionalized environment, and parties is not a shock to them, and they expected them. But I wonder, sometimes I wonder whether they could envision these being continental national parties. I think there's a geography to this that they didn't foresee, that these parties would coalesce into national entities spanning multiple states and over a continent. I mean, so I think the factional argument that Madison makes, I think he's probably thinking, remember, he's trying to address small scale, big scale issues there in Fed 10. And so I think his solution is the geography and the factions that will emerge in this vast place. Don't worry about it. We'll have plenty of these mini parties, these factions to neutralize. So the nationalization of parties, I think, may be something that the founders couldn't have envisioned how it evolved.
Well, and the other thing too is not only that. I mean, obviously, technology, the idea of being able to reach a mass audience, they could not have anticipated that. I mean, let's face it. Even though there were, I guess you would call it. I mean, I don't know, Tim. You're going to help me on this because I don't know. You would call them national publications, but you had things that were being published, but it didn't have the scope of one tweet or one electronic post, right?
Right.
And the other thing is too, is a guy that we've mentioned before, or at least I probably have, is Duverger, the French philosopher. You know, that whenever you, with the system that we have, with the winner take all, or that first past the post,
Yeah.
Duverger, who was a French political scientist, said that, you know, inevitably you're just going to have two parties. And so even though Madison's talking about these multiplicity of factions, we don't have that multiplicity of factions. Now, you may have factions within the major political parties, but you just don't have that multiplicity of factions. And then when it becomes about control on a national level, on a national policy level, it becomes really cutthroat, and you're not going to have a lot of competing viewpoints. You're going to have, like, they're two teams,
Well,
basically.
yeah, only other thing I'd add to that, and this gets into maybe, David, this is what you were getting at with your critique, which I think is a good one. I think Federalist 10 to me is where Madison missteps in his logic, right? Because there's this notion that all factions are created equal. And maybe at the time, without industrialization and without big corporations, that's the only thing that Madison and others could imagine. But Madison feared tyranny of the majority, right? And the way interest group politics works these days, and the way our politics works, it's really tyranny of the minority, right? It's big corporations, it's big money that are able to rule the day in terms of policymaking for the most part, right? So that's upset this equation, I think, that we have about factions sort of offsetting factions, and that it wasn't going to be zero sum. You were going to lose sometimes and you're going to win sometimes. For the average citizen, though, in the last 20 to 30 years, when have those wins come for them, right? And their interests? It seems like they've been fewer and far between than they've been in previous times. And it's something I think Madison just couldn't see with his crystal ball.
Well, Chris, and you mentioned Mann and Ornstein earlier, and one, I'd like to get your thoughts of to what extent and you agree with them that the system is broken there. But I'm trying to fuse a little bit of what Mike said into this. So they, to be fair to them, they had no idea about corporations, technology, all this change. So I guess part of my question to you, Chris, is did they provide for a system to adapt and be flexible to the changing conditions that they could not anticipate? I mean, it seems to me that, okay, they provided for an amendment system, but as we've talked about before, it's an amendment system that's extremely difficult there. So is one of the reasons, I guess this is my argument, one of the reasons I think it's broken is because it does not allow, all right, for a lot of flexibility and the adaptation of the system to changing conditions, like, right, the rise of mega corporations after the Civil War, and today with social media and all those things. So what are your thoughts, on that?
I do think, I think the system, I think the system, or just say the Constitution, I think the Constitution provides for that. I think it's operator error. I think what I see is the fact that, I don't think the Constitution itself is other than the amendment process and perhaps interpretation of it. The Constitution is there. I mean, if you look Article 1, Section 8, we know Congress is throughout the document, but listing of these enumerated powers, those haven't changed. I think that's flexible enough to allow lawmakers to respond to the needs that we have as a society. I don't think the lawmakers have the political will to do that today because, one, money in politics is so pervasive that you have to be constantly raising money for reelection, because for many American politicians, their goal seems to be is to be reelected, and you have to go to where the money is. That means you have to be beholden to people with deep pockets. And I think that creates an issue. I think both Tim and Mike mentioned gerrymandering earlier as well. So I think you think about money in politics, and let's face it, when the Supreme Court says money is speech, well, as a public school teacher, I don't have a lot of money, so my speech is limited. But if I'm Apple, if I'm Google,
Yeah, but you have the NEA or the the AFT. You got national unions that you donate to and can have a voice, right? Isn't that the argument?
Well, not in Wisconsin. They were those were gutted. One of the things I can't help but think is some people would make the argument, hey, the system's working well at the state level. I mean, we've been talking kind of as a national entity here, but the federalism, I mean, here's the F word again. Federalism provides for all kinds of opportunities for it to work well and work dysfunctionally well. So I think there's a federalism piece that that provides some space to consider the fact that I mean, ALEC, this organization that the conservatives have used quite well and quite effectively in local state level electoral politics. So I think some people would say the system's great, and the national doesn't matter much anymore because all the action's at the state.
You see that being played out right now. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of the most recent Dobbs decision, but you've seen that being played out right now. Some states, with trigger laws, so that's going to enact legislation. You have other states that are codifying the right to reproductive choice, and so to illustrate Tim's point about there's legislation happening, but it's happening at the state level. And for viewers, students and teachers, ALEC stands for American Legislative Exchange Council, and they're responsible for a lot of legislation that happens at the state level.
Mike, you're going to say?
Well, we kind of, to answer the question, is the system broken, or how well, to reverse it around and say, how well is it working at the national or state level? My political sciencey mind wants to say, okay, how are we defining working well? Like, are we talking about establishing justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense? Like, what are we going to the
silly man.
Because we do know, and this is maybe at the national level, most statistics, most data we have on socioeconomic developmental indicators, the United States, we've talked about this on this program, as a country, we rank near last on most of these indicators, right? So if you define, like, one thing a government should do is promote the health of its citizens, all of its citizens. Well, I think there's an argument that the system, we can say, is broken. By most measures, we are not doing that. And disproportionately, it's people of color who are the ones who are most affected by it. So, but are we, if the goal is to provide an environment where people can arm themselves, if that's the goal, then yeah, like, we're not broken. The system's working just like it should. So I think it depends on what you are what that variable is. What is it your goal is?
Well, I think a healthy constitutional democracy, Mike, has a majority of the people who have faith in its institutions and the legitimacy of that government. And again, piggybacking on what you just said, all right, the data shows that Americans, that a majority of Americans don't have faith in much of anything. All right, the only institution I'm aware of that has high numbers, and which I find interesting, is the United States military. Other than that, no other institution breaks the 50% barrier. But I am wondering, to Chris and Mike. Okay, let's assume for a moment, Mike, that it is broken. All right, based upon my definition of how we would determine that. isn't it in last analysis, it's not the institutions, it's the people themselves. That the reason we're having the problems is the citizenry of this country. All right, that's where the finger should be pointed. Am I right? Wrong?
Well, sure, but I also think it'd be interesting to see if maybe Mike knows this. Are there polls about comparing confidence in the Senate versus confidence in the House? I mean, I have to believe that if I mean, my own view of this is that what's really broken is the Senate, where all things go to die, and so maybe the brokenness is allowing them to create their own rules and their own in a sense constitutional operation within the Uber Constitution. That's the derailing factor. So I don't, and I don't know, Mike, whether there's studies that do that comparison between what's broken worse, the Senate or the House.
There is that data. I don't have it at my fingertips, though. I was just trying to look for it. I'll keep looking as we're chatting.
Okay.
It's like one of my favorite Madison quotes in the We the People textbook in Unit 2 is Madison said at the convention, we've departed from justice to conciliate the smaller states in the creation of the Senate. I mean, he did not that's not the Senate that he wanted. So if you think about this, the guy that we call the father of the Constitution says we've departed from justice, right, to conciliate the smaller. So, I mean, he was pretty good on that. And I would think this too, in terms of whether it's broken. I keep, obviously we've had the anniversary of Watergate that's gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of weeks. And as you dive deep into the history of what happened with the Watergate scandal, knowing full well that it was, Barry Goldwater and other Republican senators that went to the White House and told President Nixon, you need to resign because you're going to be impeached and you'll be found guilty and you'll be kicked out of office. And plus the fact that the midterms were coming up. So there was a little bit of that in there too. But and then if you look at the revelations coming out of the January 6th committee hearings, and the people that want to say they're partisan, they're right. That is very partisan because you have mostly Republicans asking the questions and you have Republicans answering the questions. So it's been very partisan. To throw that out there, you think with Representative Cheney and Representative Kinzinger, though people will say, well, they're rhinos or whatever that term is that they want to use, but they're members of the Republican Party asking most of the questions. And as you see this information coming out of the January 6th committee hearing, you can't help but think, well, where are the Goldwaters today? Maybe Liz Cheney is it, right? Who's saying, well, wait a minute, let's look at this information. Let's look at this testimony under oath. And in the last, half a century, we've really kind of, I don't know, taken a turn.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was just going to say, Dave, my answer to your question is it's probably a combination of both, which I know you're not going to be satisfied with, a broken society and broken institutions. I do think that that's the case, and I can't believe I'm gonna make this argument. I don't know how much I sincerely want to believe it, but we are much more democratic than we were at the founding. Like we directly elect senators, and we directly elect presidents in a way that the founders did not imagine we were going to do. And I think what that means is that politicians to get elected need to respond more to the people. Right,
Mike, we don't directly elect presidents, though.
But more so than in the 19th and 18th.
You're the primary process now, Chris. I mean, you know this. It's the parties don't play, the electors don't play the role that they were meant to play at the founding. So in that way, I think primaries with presidential elections, directly electing the Senate, those are two institutions that were meant to be kind of filtered from the people. And then finally, I would say, and Tim and Chris can back me up on this or say I'm completely out of my mind. Madison and others had this notion that we were in a representative democracy, right? And the civic virtue of the representatives, I think, was taken seriously. Like they would need to negotiate, try things, and compromise as much as they were partisan, as much as they were polarized. And I think that most of the profiles of those who are in Congress today as Chris was saying, don't fit that profile. There's little notion of civic virtue. There's little notion of public orientedness. It's more about their own interest in careerism, or their interest in the party, or their interest in getting their talking points so they can raise their money. And I think that is both a cause and a reflection of the society that we're in.
Tim accuses me quite often of overly romanticizing certain aspects of history, but I started off this session with with a rant about this I know to be true, and to give some kudos to the historical evolution of this country. I look at every problem we have today in the 21st century, and at some time in history we did remedy it. If we look at the rise of the large corporations in the late 19th century and their power at the turn of the century, by the end of World War II, we had come up with regulations and antitrust laws and things to try to bring some balance to the free enterprise system and the good of workers and consumers and such. If we look at civil rights, and inequality in this country, we had done so. If we look at gender issues, we had done so. If we, over and over again, if we look at money and politics, Chris, we had tons of legislation, all right, both pre-Watergate and post-Watergate, to curtail the influence of money. But since, I guess my magic data, since 1980, we've created an institutional inertia in order to protect and maybe revive this conservative natural state of the American culture here to protect the status quo, and it's all gone away. So I do want to give kudos, and I don't want to be a Debbie Downer the whole time about our system. What has gotten me so down now is that in my lifetime, I was able to see or live and experience the system working and fixing these major problems, not easily and not quickly, but over time. And I look at every major problem I have with our country today. We had a fairness doctrine. If we look at communication, and we had remedies to all this, and it's all been usurped, and we've now gone full circle back to the early industrial period of laissez-faire, government being the friend of the corporate moneyed interests. And to some certain degree, there are voices out there calling for white male dominance again. And it's very disturbing. But in the last analysis, the only way that happened is that the people allowed it to happen. And so there was maybe some cultural shift, I don't know what it was, in which the American people, got told that all of these changes that we'd experienced in the 20th century were somehow a bad thing. and we are where we are. I'm sorry to kind of go off on a rant, but like I said, I don't want to be seen as a Debbie Downer the whole time.
I think this goes back to, David, your point earlier, and I was thinking about, and I think Tim was making a point. It made me think also as in terms of national media, driving the bus. And as people have, as we've squared off into our camps or into our tribes, and where it used to be most folks were somewhere about here if you want to do a linear political scale, which is a very simplified view of it, I understand. But you think most folks are somewhere in here, but what's happened over the last 40 years or so is you start to see this separation and this polarization get greater. And I think that the idea of the national media driving that as well, I think is also a factor in terms of increasing that polarization. I don't think.
We have cable and the decentralization of. Information is there's not a public nature to information. It's consumeristic. It's capitalism meets information. So the fact that I think the way I look at it is, if Chris is right, and I think he is, that there's this middle, there was an assumption that 3 networks could tell us what we needed to think about. And there were some variations from network to network, but now I think there's no publicness to shared information. So I think the decentralization in cable is in large part the consumerization and of preference information rather than public information.
Yeah, Dave, and I would just agree with you. And I think your time period that you're putting on this actually aligns with. I was just finishing up Fukuyama's new book this week, Liberalism and Its Discontents, and it's his attempt to save liberalism from what he sees as its downfall on the right and the left. And he marks it in the 1980s as well, when this idea of the state, this Reagan's sort of mantra of the state has no positive role to play in society. He calls that neoliberalism, and he says that's not consistent with what states should be doing. They should be solving problems that the market can't solve. And on the left, his criticism is that it's coming out of the counterculture and identity politics. He says now has fractionalized society in ways that is not consistent with the notion of the universalism that liberalism kind of presupposes. So I think your time period here is not, I'm just pointing out to the students, this isn't like a partisan time period. It's not to say blaming Republicans. It's blaming, I don't think, a point in time where major changes started to happen both with the elites and then with the society as large.
Well, I'll go there. I was in DC several years ago, more than several, and doing some stuff. And Mann and Ornstein were presenting it to a small group of people. And it was really enlightening because these are two political scientists that have been covering DC for years. During one of the breaks, I went up to ask them, I said, I really appreciate what you guys are saying and stuff. I'm really taking a crap ton of notes here, but I got to go back and talk to my students. And it's like, what, when did compromise become a dirty word? Because I always taught students that politics is compromise. We have so many people with so many different viewpoints coming to a location, whether it be a state capital or whether it be the national capital. And so I'm saying, where you guys have been studying this for a long time? Help me out here. What's one thing I can point to? And both guys, without missing a beat and without conferring with each other, both said the same thing: Newt Gingrich. And they said what we traditionally did was we would have dinner like every few months with some freshman congressmen that we thought were going to be up and comers, that were going to be, keep an eye on these folks. And it was off the record, and just to check in with them on how their careers are going. And they were having dinner one night, and they said even his Republican colleagues were surprised because he said he was willing to burn down the institution of Congress to obtain party control. So if you go back to think about the time frame you mentioned, David, the early 1980s, right? And this contract with America or contract on America, depending on your perspective. It was interesting, these two longtime political scientists, and yeah, they both lean left. There's no doubt about that. Norm Ornstein, definitely, for sure. But they both mentioned Gingrich and his willingness to burn down, that's the term they use, burn down the institution to achieve party superiority. And that's where you start to get into the idea of, purity kind of things, or Grover Norquist, where you have to take the pledge about taxes, those types of things. And so I think you go back 40 plus years and you start to see that pulling apart for maintaining a power.
So would love to spend more time on Congress, but probably time to move to the executive branch for a moment.
Everything's so much easier, right?
Yeah, it's so much easier to go to the executive branch. As I said earlier, the framers were so cautious of the legislative branch that they specifically power was granted to them, and it was specific. Also, there were limits enumerated. But with Article 2, Professor Moore, there seems to be a lot of vagueness, especially in the word vested. executive power is vested in one president there. In your opinion, what's the explanation of that vagueness, and has that vagueness been problematical for our federal republic?
Oh, sure. And the first tremendous fight between Congress and the executive was over the vesting clause. And I would suggest that the word "all" is as troublesome as vested. All executive power is vested. So, okay, they don't define that, but they say it's all there. So I think the vagueness is, to your point, has proven to be tremendously problematic, and it was so right out of the gate, the vagueness of Article 2. And the Anti-Federalists, in my view, are quite prescient in their critiques of Article 2. And one Anti-Federalist said, look, I'm not concerned about Washington, but it's everybody that comes after Washington. So I think the Anti-Federalists were right on that, the vagueness and of Article 2. Yes.
Well, I'm curious, and this is to all three of you, but we'll start with Tim. What about those individuals who occupied the office themselves? How did they view? And you just said, people weren't really that concerned about Washington, and we've got plenty of examples of Washington showing self-restraint within the office. But especially in the 19th century, what's your sense of how those who occupied the office saw executive power?
Well, the great example there of the flip-flopping is Jefferson on Louisiana. He goes ahead and does it and doesn't think it's constitutional. And he advocates for kind of a retroactive amendment to baptize the baby there on that. Madison's a great example. He reauthorizes the bank as the president, whereas he was fundamentally opposed to the bank in the 90s. So I think there is something to that. Once you get, again, this is theory versus practice. Once you get in that chair, administrating the government is different than thinking about the government.
Yeah, so, I'm a simple man with a simple mind who likes simple answers there. So I want to point the finger, and I'm going to point the finger at Theodore Roosevelt, because it seems to me that there's a roller coaster ride in the 19th century, and especially post-Lincoln. You've got kind of congressional dominance, all right, and some very weak executive officers or presidents there. But Roosevelt, who some historians say pretty much defined or created the imperial presidency, ever since Roosevelt, we've just had a continuous and then leveling off possibly of executive power. Is there a consensus here in the group that that's where the finger needs to be pointed? Is Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt really redefined or defined the modern office? Chris?
Well, sure. And there's a national industrial economy that emerges too, that I think creates the space for executive leadership. So,
well, not that too, but I think it's also the politics of personality with TR, because he was so widely popular with the people. When they try and stick him at a dead end job in the vice presidency. Was it Mark Hanna that was like, you guys don't know what you're doing. You're putting this madman one bullet away from the presidency, which, yeah, go figure. You don't talk about the no-hitter while you're pitching the no-hitter, I suppose. But, I think it's part of that, David, back to your question about pointing the finger at TR. I think he was so popular with people that members of Congress tended to back away a little bit because they didn't want to have to directly challenge what he's doing in terms of that very active executive branch under TR, right? There's famous line, "I let Congress debate while I took the canal," right?
Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I partially agree. I definitely think what TR does for me is he legitimizes the in the imagination of the American public that there can be this strong executive, not during a time of a civil war or not during a time of just a crisis, right?
Right.
And it goes back to what we started the conversation with, David, with this notion of accountability, right? I mean, we can teach the overlapping separated system to students and talk about it with citizens. To some extent, as human beings living in a country, like who do we blame and who do we give credit to? Like, who's the person I can look to? And TR fit that bill of he wanted to take that on, right? Now, I think it starts with TR in terms of the imagination legitimizing that this could happen in a sustained way. But it's really when we get to FDR that the tools are actually given, right? And those tools are given, by Congress. Congress is the one that allows the executive branch to expand in ways to where the executive branch can just play hardball with the legislative branch in a way that they couldn't do on a sustained basis in the 18th and 19th century. So it starts with TR, but then it really comes to FDR's period of giving that infrastructure that outlasts the big personality, like Chris said. You don't have to have a big personality after FDR, because you come to the White House, you come to the executive branch, you have more people working for you than the legislative branch does, and you can just out-muscle them on most issues.
So Mike, and I kind of, I was going to ask you about this kind of expanding and contracting notion. And I do believe after TR, there is a contraction in the 1920s, after the progressive presidents of TR and Taft and Wilson, that there's somewhat of a contraction. And then we, of course, get FDR. And I don't know if there's been a contraction since FDR, but I am wondering, do you think it's at all possible for a contraction of executive power to happen, in your lifetime?
Sure. I think you could argue that the Carter presidency might have been a contraction, but it's with that line. It's increasingly executive power is going to get more and more and more.
Well,
So go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mike, but isn't Nixon resigning a contraction?
Yeah, I'd still agree with Mike that it's a brief window.
Okay.
And that was I think that's the whole Cheney and Rumsfeld approach, that they were fearful that the executive would be clipped permanently. And so a long sustained effort to reestablish the presidency, as I read their interpretation and the history of starting, after Carter and the reestablishment of the executive branch, starting with Reagan.
Well, it seems to me that the natural state of man, and I think this was just talked about a little bit previously by a couple of you, the natural state of man is to want a singular father figure. All right. And, blaming Congress is too difficult because, it's so many, but we're monarchical, or we like.
Or we're Freudian. My goodness here, David.
No, well, no, but again, and again, I think, from the adoption of the Constitution through much of the 19th century, and a lot due to the fact of the size and the type of communication that existed, it was very difficult for that singular office to consolidate power. But in our lifetimes, that's not the case anymore. But what always frustrates me, and while I taught over those 30 years, is during presidential elections, is the type of questions that candidates would get. What are you going to do for me in healthcare? What are you going to do for me in transportation? What are you going to do for me in education? When in fact, those powers don't exist in the executive office. All right. But at least probably since FDR, we have created, all right. And that's why I get back to the people and their responsibility. And all we have to do is we look, Tim, you have, I think, an overly romantic, notion of the role of states and federalism and states being laboratories. But look at the turnout.
Oh,
in
no, wait. I was
non-presidential-
just pointing out the fact that they existed and that's what's going on. To make any normative statement about what my preferences are is a little bit of a stretch.
Okay,
Dear
must
sir.
I must have heard you gushing when you weren't gushing there, kind of thing. My apologies on that there, but
But David, let me support what you're saying. Theodore Lowy, who's a great presidential historian. I think one of his lines was, "The American people want the Wizard of Oz." Right? If you remember the movie where he reaches into his black bag and he's got the wizard, that has something for everybody in the film version, not the book version. In the film version, he's got something for everybody. I think that's what Lowy said. Everybody expects the Wizard of Oz because they expect him, or at some point her, to be able to reach into that black bag and pull out something for everybody. And I think that goes back to a line from Shakespeare, and he said, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, because we've moved away from these first principles, these founding principles, and you've seen Congress retreat, and you've seen the executive, whether it be with TR or FDR, you see the executive branch, Congress, if you're not going to use it, I'll step in and take it." And so we have this idea of this is where the power is, because people don't know. And I think I mentioned this before on this program, when Clinton was campaigning and Trump was campaigning for 2016, one of the networks had a commander-in-chief forum, right, on an aircraft carrier. So one candidate came out and asked questions about his commander-in-chief, and then the other candidate came out. And I was really proud of my students, because my students were beside themselves, because they said, if you read Article 2, Section 2, Paragraph 2, you're commander-in-chief when the military is called into service, and the Congress is supposed to do the calling. And yet in this forum, the made for TV event, there's no mention of Congress and their power to control the militia and control the military and the rules that they have. Even Madison said that, Congress has the power, and these are the 3 C's. Students, you can use this. This is Madison right out of a Pacificus Helvetius debate. Congress has the power to commence, conduct, and conclude war. So we've moved away from that because of our lack of knowledge. And so we just expect the president to do it all.
So, Mike, assuming that we all agree that executive power has been somewhat of a runaway train in the last 70 years or so, what do you see as the most effective tool in the toolbox to contain that runaway power? How do we restrain it?
Yeah, my go-to answer on this for years has always been Congress. Like, Congress has all the tools at its disposal to check the president and to do exactly what Chris said. The trick has always been that you would need a majority in Congress willing to do that, which means they're being elected by people who want them to do that. And I think what the past 4 or 5 years have pointed out to us, there's 40% of our population who are perfectly fine with an executive, of not curtailing executive power, even when presented with all the examples of how that is maybe bad for the nation and bad for our self-interest. So are we ever going to get a majority? How do we get a majority in Congress to take back this power when the same voters that are voting for the Congress are also wanting this strong president? So I don't know what to say now. I guess this gets me in kind of the Debbie Downer, because I'm not sure how Congress can exercise that role if public opinion is to the extent to where we want that. I'm going to borrow from Jack Nicholson now, right? You want that person on that wall. You need that person on that wall, right? And that's going to be tough to rectify.
So, Yeah, it is. It is. If somebody has a solution, feel free to call us. So let's get to Tim's favorite subject, and that is federalism there. And so, Professor Moore, I know I've asked you this before, but the purpose here is to talk to students and teachers as as they get into the text. And I still wonder, to what degree was the outcome of the design of our federal republic intentional, or based upon certain philosophical principles, or to what degree was it just happen chance? It just kind of fell that way in Philadelphia.
Well, you can't have. I don't think it's happenstance. I think. You have legacy of colonial separateness, and that separateness translates into this idea of each state a colonial and eventually a state sovereignty. I think our federal system also is a political bargain. I think I've said this before. There's no way they could have got a constitution ratified if they didn't insert state influence to some degree. Remember, Madison goes to the convention and he kind of wants to not obliterate states, but he certainly wants to minimize them to a large extent by saying representation should be based upon people and not states. So, and that gets booted pretty quickly. And so, in the reality of the politics of state entities is tremendous at the convention. So. It's not happenstance. I think and I don't think it's any great philosophical commitment. I think it's a very practical consideration that states have to be considered in creating a constitution for the United States in the 1780s. Now we can revisit that, and my view of it is, if we're going to do it today, that we ought to tremendously limit and minimize states. But the reality is, in the 1780s, that states mattered. So it was a political bargain based upon tradition. Is how I would address it.
You've studied this more than the rest of us here combined. To what degree was Madison sincere and believed in his Virginia plan? Because his Virginia plan is significantly removed from the federal republic that we end up with.
Right.
There's a certain element of unitary structure to his Virginia plan. How sincere was he about that, or was it a negotiation kind of strategy that he had?
No, I think it becomes a negotiation strategy. I think he went into the system, into the summer, believing that. I mean, he's a big state guy, and he wants big states to run. I mean, the whole representation scheme he comes up with is anti-small state. And so I do think he's tremendously frustrated at the Faustian bargain of the small states at the convention.
I think a good exercise for students and teachers is to take Madison's vices on the political system,
Yep.
lay that out, because he just goes through point by point by point, and then put the Virginia plan next to it, right? Because I'm serious, because here are the problems as I see them. Here are the solutions as I see them, right? So if you put Madison's vices of the American political system where he's ripping on the Confederation that we have, and then you look at the Virginia plan, I think he was very sincere in the Virginia plan. But it goes back to the convention where it all becomes a negotiation. It all becomes.
And Hamilton wants to obliterate the states altogether at the convention, and I believe he was sincere too, but totally unworkable in terms of getting that out of the convention or ratified.
So, Chris, if you read the Constitution textually, literally,
I try not to.
I'm wondering, one, I keep hearing an awful lot these days about the 10th Amendment, but I am curious, what specific limits, all right, are there on the national government? What's been enumerated in the document as far as a limit on the national government? And can you give me an example in the last, I'll say 70 years, where you think Congress, all right, not what the Supreme Court thinks, but that you think Congress has abused, all right, those limits?
I'll go back to the actual language of the document. And if you begin with Article 1, it says all legislative power herein granted. And I think that herein granted is doing a lot of lifting in 1787, 1788. Because if you look at Article 2, it just says the executive power will be vested, right? And so we're not even clear what the executive power is. It's just the executive power will be vested. So with that, the idea of herein granted, I think, is the limit. Then you throw that, and I think that you start with herein granted, and you throw the 10th Amendment in there, right? I think that sets you up a parameter for the power. In terms of your last part of your question, I'm trying to think of.
Well, hold on. Before we get to that, can I ask you one? Article 1, Section 8, I believe, is Clause 1. There's this general welfare clause, tied to taxation. Okay, so isn't general welfare rather expansive as far as power?
Yeah.
And what's the check on that general welfare clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1?
Well, the Anti-Federalists said there was none. I mean, they honed in on that. To your point, David, they honed in on that a lot.
As well as a necessary and proper clause, right?
Yep.
They thought it was going to be like a new declaratory act. So in terms of, is there a check on, well, you know what? I'm going to borrow this. I just found this just sitting right here. So let me take a look at this. And it's cool. The beauty of it is we do have an owner's manual. And so when you're not sure, just go to the owner's manual and see what it has to say.
Yeah, but it's written in Chinese.
I'm surprised Tim has that. I thought he just had Wisconsin state constitutions laying around.
Well, that's over there that's under the gushing category.
The Waukesha Municipal Code out.
That's right.
This is how we roll.
Now.
This is how we roll in the Shaw. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excise, to pay for the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare. Yeah, so when you get to do that and promote the general welfare, so yeah, that's general welfare is somewhat nebulous. But I'm going back to I don't know. I guess maybe
here's my thing is in where I live, and it may be true, Chris, where you live. Where I live, a day doesn't go by without a letter in the local paper talking about this runaway national government and all these things they're doing that violate the Constitution. And I'm getting up there in age, and I've kind of lost the energy to fight the fights, through the local newspaper. But I'm trying to think about a single law, which I can literally point to the Constitution and say, yep, Congress and the national government doesn't have that power.
Well, I think that you would say that, okay, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, even though it's called Obamacare, and we know that the Obama administration had a hand in its legislation, in writing that legislation, as the Congress provides, as the Constitution provides for, right? The president does have that power, according to the Constitution, to recommend legislation, but it ultimately has to be passed by Congress. I think there are a lot of people would say that the Obamacare, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, its formal name, is a bridge too far for them. Even though the court, Chief Justice John Roberts maybe switched his opinion at the last minute, finding the taxing power made it legitimate. So I think some people would say that's gone too far.
Well, if that's the case, then doesn't Medicare go too far?
I'm just saying, I'm throwing out the some people thing here. So depending on which way you're bred.
Right, but if you invalidate the Affordable Care Act, you have to invalidate quite possibly Medicare and Social Security. By what authority does Congress have to do that?
I'm not disagreeing.
Other than, again, the general welfare clause.
Some people would focus in on the agencies, actually. The agencies usurping that I've got. I mean, some of the wetlands legislation really rankles a lot of people's sensibilities. I mean, here in Wisconsin. So I think it's, I would suggest that the culprit, the easy low hanging fruit to say overstep boundary are the agencies more so than Congress.
But the agencies are created by Congress.
Yes, they are. And as you know, it's hard to rein in agency decisions. I forget what that court case was. Once you create an agency, it's a runaway train. Chevron, I think maybe.
Chevron doctrine, yeah.
But
well, I think we're going to see a reversal of the Chevron doctrine.
Well, we might.
Fairly quickly.
We might.
There and maybe, and again, for those who think that it's a runaway national government, it'll be another day to celebrate. So we're coming up to the end here, and I want to finish with our expert and our passionate lover of Unit 6, Professor Williams here. I think we would all agree, and Mike, you kind of articulated that earlier, that the people, for the most part, as a whole, we kind of lack in virtue, as understood in a Republican sense there. But one of the things that I think contributes is the federal system. And one of the things that I read once in a political science textbook was this notion of voter fatigue. As we get ready for another election coming up, and I look at the California potential ballot, I'm tired just trying to read it. And so would you agree that the federal system actually is a disincentive for people to participate rather than an incentive for people to participate?
I think that anytime you're asking people to, there's going to be the collective action problem, no matter federal system or not. But to the extent that there are so many different elections, especially here in California, so much you need to know to make an informed choice. Yeah, I think it can be a disincentive, which is one of the ways that parties were supposed to help, right? Parties were meant to be a way to help us feel comfortable going to the ballot box, maybe not knowing every single issue backwards and forwards, but we trust our political party most of the time, so we're going to do what our political party says. And with a movement away from political parties and a lack of trust in political parties, I think that combines with, yes, making it, it's ironic, right? Because it's like we have all of these entry points where we as citizens can get involved at the very local level on these issues that really do matter day to day. Whether our water is clean, whether the trash is being picked up, whether the roads are roads that you can drive on safely. And it's most likely in those elections for people that make those decisions that most of us aren't voting. So I think it is part of voter fatigue. I think it's also part of just what we've been talking about these last 40 years. It's what have you done for me lately, government? And if you don't feel like the government is going to be there, why put in the initiative to do it, to do it?
So, gentlemen, as we've kind of been doing for the last few sessions, is I'd like to close with your insights for teachers and students on how to approach Unit 4. My thought, students, is again, I'm somewhat of a Debbie Downer these days, being a boomer and seeing what I'm seeing happen in the United States of America. But I do think that since you're dealing with institutions of government, that there are periods in which should make us all proud. And I specifically look from the mid-30s to the mid-60s, and I look at the things that our government did to address the injustices, both socially, economically, and politically, to try to make this a more perfect union. And so as you do your studies, there is plenty of ammunition out there to criticize our system as it currently exists. But historically, there's also some really great examples of this country working as those few idealists that existed in the 1780s had hoped that it would. So Professor Williams, what insights, thoughts do you have as students and teachers go through Unit 4?
Yeah, I was thinking about just the title of this unit, right? How the values and principles embodied in the Constitution shaped American institutions and practices. And I would just have students come at this meta question. Those values and principles are contested. So it's not like it's an easy, like, you need to think about how they've been contested over time, from the beginning until just recently with the Dobbs decision, right? And then I'd also, the more meta way I'd have students think about this is not only thinking about how these values, as contested as they are, shape politics or shape institutions and practices, but how do those institutions and practices shape the principles and values that we see in the Constitution? I mean, to get to the points that were made earlier, Governor Reagan said that Medicare and Medicaid would lead to socialism. And now public opinion polls suggest that no American thinks that Medicare and Medicaid is at all inconsistent with the values and principles in the Constitution. So the way to get out of the Debbie Downer mode is to realize that the practices of institution can actually then reshape values. But these things are constantly going to be in motion and constantly going to be fluctuating.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, we've brought this up before, and I'm listening to Mike, and I can't help but think that does policy drive culture? Does culture drive policy? And I think that's what Mike is getting to there for the students to think about these values and principles, identifying those, and how well have we, the institutions put in place, the three branches of government, along with state governments, because you don't want to neglect those. But I'll don't forget too that, go back and read Fed 47 through 51 to understand what Madison's talking about. And Tim alluded to this earlier in the broadcast, that we separate out the powers, but not exclusively, right? There, it really truly is a blended system, and think about that. And the other thing I think that we kind of do a short shrift on is the administrative state that we just alluded to with executive agencies, because therein lies a lot of power within the national government, because Congress will pass a law, they'll create an executive agency to carry out that law, to take care that the law be faithfully executed. I would look at that interplay between Congress and the administrative state that we have these days.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I think Mike's point is really deserves bearing out again. Look, these values are contested from the very beginning. Yes, we have separation, but we have sharing. How can that not lead to conflict and rattle and hum? So I guess my thought about the unit is, and that's why I like what the center has done with this unit. They've made it less about policy and more about the constitutional. I'm stuck with the phrase rattle and hum. These are not static things. And Mike's point is they were contested at the beginning. So I think seeing these branches as a continual contest of these values or how they're played out, I think is a good way to think about this unit.
Well, students, I hope you noticed the U2 reference, and that would be the band that Professor Moore made. I didn't know he listened to any music post 1980, so that's encouraging for all of us. Next time we see us, boy, are we going to have some rattle and hum, because we're going to be looking at rights in the Bill of Rights, and also maybe some unenumerated rights there. And I know that that's Professor Moore's favorite unit, is to talk about rights. There.
I'm gushing. I'm gushing already. Is
there anything going on with rights these days?
I don't know. We'll have to check and see in our next session. Until then, enjoy your summer. Peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye-bye.